Good morning, everybody. We are starting the statistics unit. We're going to start today with gathering data. First, really quickly, I want to talk about some of the learning targets that we're supposed to be covering here, some of the standards. So some of the probability stuff has been covered in previous classes. So we're supposed to be covering these. And the problem with these particular learning targets or standards is that this is basically, if I look at it more seriously, what I cover in AP statistics for all of second semester. So it's a lot of information, and we have 5 days to cover it. So we're going to kind of break it down a little bit to the basics as much as we can. So this first one, we're going to be covering some sampling methods and bias. So first off, if we think about the following scenario, we want to collect data about student drug use. Rather than survey the entire school, we create a 5-question survey and give it to a sample of 30 students. What, if any, concerns do you have about the following methods of finding 30 students to survey? Asking all the people in your first period class. So this isn't inherently a problem unless your first period class is like AP statistics or something like that. So a first period class could be a problem, and this is what's called a convenience sample. Basically just occurs when we sample those that are closest to us. And you know, it's not random, so that's generally a problem. Ask the first 30 people who walk through the door in the morning. Again, this is another way of doing a convenience sample. And the problem with that is if you're there early in the morning, let's say at 7:30, and you're sampling people who are just walking in the door, apart from the practicality of stopping people and asking the first 30 people to answer a question about drug use, you're also looking at people who are up early in the morning, get to school early, fairly responsible. So you may not get a representative idea of drug use among all of the students. Posting a survey on Facebook or whatever social media platform you prefer. This is a voluntary response sample. And those have inherent problems because the only ones who answer are people who are are typically people who are really passionate about it. The other problem with this is that it's only your friends or the people around you, and there is usually some kind of similarity between people who choose to hang out together or connect with each other on social media. Ask all your friends. Again, another convenient sample. And again, it has the same problems, as the group that you're reaching with a survey on Facebook. Ask every 10th person that walks past you between first and second period. If, practically speaking, that were easy enough to do, that one probably wouldn't be too bad. That's what's called a systematic sample. Where there's a system to it. It's not random, but that system doesn't cause an issue around who may or may not be involved in the survey. The final one, randomly generate 30 student IG numbers and track down those students and then give them the survey to complete while you wait. And I'm going to add to that, but don't watch. Like you don't watch their answers. This is what's called a simple random sample, or an SRS. And in a simple random sample, every combination of people in a sampling frame have an equal, or in a population, I think I should say, have an equal chance of being chosen. Simple random sample can be one of the better ones, not always, and we'll talk about some of that. Oh, the picture didn't come up. In class, we watched a video. If you Google The Daily Show poll bearers, that one is a good one about the problems with voluntary response. But I can't figure out how to get that on here, and it doesn't matter anyway. So, oh, look at that. There it is. That's the one you're searching for, but it's not going to play it while I'm on here. Okay, so how you gather the data matters, what we were talking about. There are 3 ways that we gather data. A sample survey, so we were talking about handing out a survey, observational studies, and experiments. The observational studies and experiments we're going to talk about in 9-2. So we're going to talk most about sample surveys today and how to put together a sample. Rather than gather information from every member of a population, so that term, population, is the entire group you want to know about. And that can be a small thing, everybody in the United States. That can be a large thing. Oh, I said that backwards. A large thing, everybody in the United States, or a small thing. Like I could think of that in terms of like, I just want to know what my students think of blah, 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 blah. And so I give 30 of my students a survey. Actually 30 would be too big, but we'll talk about that later. Finish my thought there. So we take a sample, and a sample is a smaller group, hopefully representative, that's going to give us information that we need. The sample must be representative. It's better if it's randomly selected. If it's an experiment, the treatment must be randomly selected. Treatment groups must be randomly selected. We'll talk about that again later. And the sample can't be too big and too small. We'll get into the specifics of that later. A lot of people tend to think that 30 people is too small of a sample. And generally speaking, it's not really. The bigger the sample is, the better of an idea you're going to find out what's going on up to a certain point, and then it becomes a problem. Okay, so on the video clip, there were a lot of polls from cable news stations and some really, really high numbers, like 93% showed up, a whole lot. And Jon Stewart, this was back in the Jon Stewart days of The Daily Show, talks about how this has to do with the audience. And this is what's often wrong with a voluntary response bias. When people choose to take part in a survey, it's usually one of 2 reasons. They're part of a specific audience, which is, may lean one way or another, politically speaking or morally speaking or whatever. Or with voluntary response, you get a lot of people who really, really care about a topic. And if you think about it in terms of like a Yelp review or a review of a product on Amazon, I personally have bought a lot of stuff off of Amazon, but I really only review the stuff that really, really sucks or is really, really good. So generally speaking, you're not getting that middle ground with voluntary response. So for an example, some people, not a voluntary response, a different one. Anyway, some people have been complaining that the children's playground at a local park is too small and in need of repair. Managers of the park decide to survey city residents to see if they believe the playground should be rebuilt. They hand out the surveys to parents who bring their kids to the park, describe possible problems with this method. That shouldn't be a question mark. That should be a period. Sorry. So we talked in class a lot about a lot of the problems here. Part of the problem is they're only getting the surveys from the people who are there. So the people that they're missing are the people who either don't know about the park, don't go to the park, or more importantly, don't like the park, so they don't go to it. The problem that causes, and this is a source of bias, is an undercoverage issue. An undercoverage occurs when a certain portion of the population is specifically left out from being able to take a survey. So specific part of the population is left out of the sampling frame. The sampling frame is all the people that might be chosen to take the survey. So it makes it impossible for them to take it. Okay. So, I forgot I put that on a slide, so we'll just go ahead and skip right over that. But I do want to talk about biases. So bias, the way that we use it a lot, has more to do with, in regular speech, we talk about it as a prejudice, like some way that you're prone to believe or prone to think. But in statistics, bias is more specific to a systematic problem with how you set up a survey or get a sample. And the bias occurs by design. So this particular type of that we just talked about was undercoverage, and there are a few others we're going to talk about. Voluntary response is also one. Voluntary response sample, where people just volunteer to take part, causes voluntary response bias. So, in reference to that last one, many people, they gave this survey. Many people believe this playground is too small and in need of repair. Do you think the playground should be repaired and expanded, even if it means raising the entrance fee to the park? So, there's a few ways this phrasing could affect the outcome. So, many believe that the playground is too small and in need of repair. That's going to lead people more to the idea of we need to fix it. Means raising the entrance fee to the park, or perhaps taxes. Then that could lead people against it. So there's two ways that this could be a problem. Now, the other part of the problem is this is asking too many things in one question. So too small, in need of repair are not necessarily the same thing. There may be people who want to expand the park. So a better question that's more neutral, do you think the park should be expanded? So this isn't in reference to that. Do you think the park needs repair? And are you willing to have an increase in taxes? Are you willing to pay for it? So there are more neutral ways that you can ask questions, but when you ask a question that's not neutral, that is what's called a response bias. And we're going to talk about that more in just a minute. I'm going to give you another example. So a teacher wants to know how often students cheat on tests. She randomly selects 20 students and interviews them, asking various questions about whether, how often, and how they've cheated on tests. Now, there's a few things that can make this not so stupid, but if she randomly selects 20 students in the entire school and they don't happen to be her students, students may not care about her knowing how and when they've cheated on tests. However, generally speaking, if students are questioned by somebody that they know as a teacher and it's about cheating on tests, then they're probably not going to be terribly honest. This interview method also causes a response bias. So when we're talking about that kind of situation, if I'm a teacher and I'm standing there asking a kid, have you ever cheated on a test? How did you do it? How often do you do it? They're probably going to lie to me. Whereas if I, hand them a computer and say, can you please take this anonymous online survey, that might give me more honest answers. So both of these situations, the last two that I just talked about, are called response bias. And a response bias is basically anything in the wording or administration of a survey and by administration I mean how it was given out, that influences the outcome. Or response. So another situation, I want to know what parents and students think of my current grading system. I hand out a survey to all my students and ask them to return it by the end of the week. Let's say this is an anonymous survey. What problems may come up with this or because of this method? What comes to my mind as a teacher, and as a student, you may not know this quite as much, but as a teacher, if I hand out something that needs to go home, get signed, and come back, a lot of them are not going to come back. So if it's really easy for people to not take part, so they're given the opportunity to take part, but all they have to do is throw away your paper, delete an email, ignore a piece of mail, then they're probably not going to respond. And that causes a non-response bias. Which kind of is the same issue that comes up as a voluntary response bias, because the people who are going to respond are the ones that feel most passionately about it. So basically, it's too easy to opt out of these. And only the most passionate tend to respond. So, similar issue to voluntary response. Okay. Oh, there we are. We already have that definition down. Totally on my A game for this video, sorry. Bias is a direct result of the method of sampling or the administration of the survey. As I said before, this is all in the design. So it's important that you design these things carefully. Okay, so let's talk about a couple of sampling methods. We already talked about a few early on. SRS is a simple random sample. This can happen in several ways. Everybody's assigned a number, and we randomly generate numbers. To get our sample. Everybody has the equal chance. Every group has an equal chance. Every combination of people has an equal chance of being picked. Stratified random sample is a little bit different. Every individual still has the same chance of being picked, but in this one, we split a population into homogeneous groups. And then we randomly sample from each group. And this might happen, like if I'm doing a study or survey of Franklin High School students and I want to know what students think of, I don't know, nothing is coming to mind right now because I'm tired, of the cafeteria food. And I want to make sure that freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and seniors are representative. If I were to do a simple random sample, it's possible, not very likely, but it's possible that I could end up with a sample that has no seniors in it at all, or juniors or whatever. So if I want to make sure that each of those groups is represented, I can split it by freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, and randomly sample 20 from each group. Or I could do it proportional to the population, but basically you're splitting the population before you sample from each group, or before you randomly choose from each group. Systematic, we talked about a little bit earlier. Systematic is when we, there's a system to it. You're picking every 10th person on a list, every 20th person on a list, every other person. There's a system. It's not random, but typically it's fairly representative. A cluster sample is when we have clusters of people that already, or subjects, whatever the case may be, that already exist naturally. So different classes already exist. Those groups are already in place. So a cluster sample would be if I were to randomly select 6 classes during the day and survey everybody within that classroom. Cluster samples can be a little bit trickier to get a representative idea of what's going on because oftentimes those clusters exist for a specific reason, but sometimes those clusters just are randomly assigned themselves, and so cluster sampling can be a good option. You just have to be careful about why the clusters exist. The last two, I'm not going to write anything for. We kind of talked about it. Convenient sample is you sample the people around you. And a voluntary response is when you survey people who want to take the survey or choose to take part. Voluntary response isn't necessarily an issue in an experiment, more an issue when it's an observational study or it's a survey. And we can talk about that next time. But neither of these are valid methods. They are biased in and of themselves. Convenience, you can get a decently representative convenience sample, but usually there's a problem with it. So best to stay away from it anyway. So that's what I have for you. It's a really quick and dirty version of what we cover in 1 or 2 chapters of AP statistics, kind of the basics. So hopefully that helps, and I'll see you guys later.